It's great to see so many of you here this evening. It's wonderful to see so many of you. I am V.G. George. I'm the president of Concordia College. It really is a distinct pleasure for me to invite you and host you this evening. And we're also pleased to have our speaker, Isobel, with us this evening. And without much further ado, so that we stay on schedule, let me invite Mandana Nakai to introduce our speaker to you, and then we'll be on our way. Mandana.
Thank you, Dr. George. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a pleasure to have you with us, as always. In honor of the Women's History Month, Concordia College is privileged to present Dr. Isobel Coleman, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and the celebrated author of a timely and enlightening book, Paradise Beneath Her Feet: How Women Are Transforming the Middle East. As a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, Isobel Coleman directs the Council's Civil Society, Markets and Democracy Initiative and the Women and Foreign Policy Program. In addition to her recent book, Paradise Beneath Her Feet, she is co-author of numerous publications, including Restoring the Balance, a Middle East Strategy for the Next President, and Strategic Foreign Assistance, Civil Society in International Security. She has written extensively about politics and the Middle East. Her articles are published in Financial Times, Forbes, USA Today, Christian Science Monitor, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Washington Post, and the list continues. Dr. Coleman stated, and I quote, "There are a number of very critical foreign policy issues that intersect with the roles of women in economic and political development in my areas of focus: South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Middle East. The role of women in society is a lens for looking at a whole range of development issues. As I got into this work, I realized how important and fascinating this lens is." In her profoundly moving book, Paradise Beneath Her Feet: How Women Are Transforming the Middle East, Dr. Coleman documents her journey through the greater Middle East with clarity and empathy. Her engaging narrative depicts firsthand the lives of many women she encountered. Despite the rich complexity of their social, cultural, and ethnic differences, these women are united in their quest for equal rights within the paradigm of the Sharia, the Islamic law. Dr. Coleman's true and inspiring stories depict these women as intelligent, courageous citizens determined to bring progress and peace to the region. Her portrayal of these spirited women dispels the common myths and stereotypes only imagined by the Western world. With this amazing list of achievements, Isobel Coleman herself has said that she is most proud of her greatest accomplishment in life: her 5 children. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Isobel Coleman.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. When we were walking over here, I was asked, did I in fact make that statement? Is it true that my greatest achievement? So now I know why you were asking me that. And yes, I am very proud of my 5 children, so thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening. The Middle East is much in the news these days for so many different reasons. Every day it seems like a new country is experiencing new turmoil. There's a lot of optimism and a lot of hope and a lot of trepidation about what is happening. And it's keeping me extremely busy as someone who covers the Middle East at the Council on Foreign Relations. And I thought I would start out by telling you how I came to write this book. I'm not a women's studies or a gender studies person. My background is in development economics. I did my training in political economy. But I do focus my regional work on the Middle East. And writing about Middle East economy, writing about the political economy of the region, I kept coming back again and again to this issue of women. Because one of the things we know today in development is that the highest return in development that you can make is investing in women. It's been proven across the board in so many different circumstances that there's an extremely high return on investment when you invest in girls education in particular, when you provide economic opportunities for women. The payoff is for the woman, for her family, for the community, for the nation. In fact, there are many, many interesting studies today that show that the benefits of girls' education, not only for the girl and her family, but really for the next generation. An educated girl grows up to be an educated mother. She marries later. She has fewer children. She invests more in her family. She's far more likely to educate her own boys and girls than is an educated father. She's going to have a lower incidence of HIV. She's going to have a lower incidence of infant mortality. She's much less likely to die in childbirth herself. She's more productive. 80% today of agricultural labor in sub-Saharan Africa is female. 75 to 80% of agricultural labor in South Asia is female. Agriculture has become women's work. Men have left the fields, have gone to seek paid employment in cities. Women are left to grow the crops, the subsistence crops for the community. And women have lower levels of education. They have lower levels of productivity. The World Bank did a fascinating study showing that if you increase female literacy by just a couple of years, that the return in higher agricultural productivity is greater than increasing the plot size of the land or introducing more fertilizer, both of which are very hard to do in places like sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, which don't have access to more land and fertilizer right now. So we know that investing in women has a huge payoff, and yet the Middle East is a part of the world, and South Asia, I call it the greater Middle East. You know, it doesn't make for great copy on a book cover, Middle East and South Asia. But we know that this is a part of the world that has underinvested in half of its population. So in 2002, the UN did a very interesting report, the Arab Human Development Report. I encourage anybody who's interested in that part of the world to read this report because it really is prescient. It predicts what's going on today. It says this is a region that's in deep, deep trouble, the Arab world, for three reasons. A lack of freedom, democracy deficit, not one democracy in the Arab world. A lack of knowledge. In the entire history of the Arab world, they have translated fewer books from other languages into Arabic than Spain translates in 1 year. And a lack of rights for women. Right there, that's what this report written by Arab intellectuals hired by the UN to analyze the political economy of the region. And it's a very, very interesting report. It looks, then they've done further reports and studies looking at the huge unemployed youth in the region and the role of women. And again, I keep coming back to this role of women because it is a region that has, as I said, underinvested in half of its population, and that has consequences, both economic and political. Now, why? Why is it underinvested in half of its population? Well, for a variety of reasons. But one very big reason is that there are deep cultural and religious justifications for constraining women. And in the last 40 years, you've seen the rise of a conservative political Islamism that has equated women's rights with a whole set of negative isms: feminism, Westernism, modernism, communism, colonialism. All of these negative isms in that part of the world. And women and women's groups, secular women's groups, have suffered for that. They have been tarnished as somehow being agents of the West, of a neo-colonial agenda, of somehow being inauthentic. And today, what I see, and the question I ask is, women's rights are so important, not just from a moral perspective, not only because of a human rights perspective, and there are lots of egregious cases that you've read about in the news about women being stoned or women having their children taken away, or all these horrible things that happen, which do happen. But from my perspective, as a political economist, when you underinvest in half your population, your economy suffers, and your whole society doesn't develop along routes that the rest of the world is developing. Again, I quote a World Bank study that looked at the status of women in the Middle East and in Asia. In 1945, across all different dimensions, they were in many ways equivalent in terms of access to nutrition, how many calories women ate, how many years of schooling, how much health care they were able to access, all of these types of things. Women in China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, they had it pretty bad, actually, in 1945. Not much different than women in the Middle East. But they aggressively closed their gender gaps. And the World Bank attributes 1 to 1.5% of annual GDP growth to that closing of the gender gap, which, for any economist in the room, you know, compounded over 50 years. That's a huge, huge element of lost economic growth and productivity. In fact, the World Bank looks at China and India. And India still today has enormous gender gaps in its system in different areas. And says, India's growth has suffered versus China because of those gender gaps. So from my perspective, it's not only a human rights issue, it's not only a moral issue, it's an economic issue and a core political issue. So the question I then, as a foreign policy analyst, ask is, how is that going to change when women's rights are associated with all of these negative isms and have really gotten a bad rap in that part of the world? And the conclusion I come to is that women's rights have been repressed in the name of Islam for decades, for centuries. But today, you have a new generation of women who are engaging with more progressive interpretations of Islam and actually using religion to push for greater rights for women. And you're seeing it across the region. You're seeing it in countries from Morocco through to Afghanistan. And they're forced to do this because the countries that they live in are not secular societies. There is no separation of religion and politics. Now, 2 countries in the region that had the most secular systems, Tunisia and Egypt, no longer have those state-led, top-down, authoritarian dictators who imposed state-led women's rights on society. Tunisia is a country led by 2 dictators over the last 50 years, 55, 56 years, who have followed a model, the Ataturk model. And I always like to quote Ataturk, who was the great modernizer of Turkey. And he implemented all of these dramatic cultural changes when he took over and deposed the Ottoman regime and created the modern state of Turkey. But one of his goals was to dislodge Islam from society, from its preferred place in society, and he also promoted women. First Supreme Court justice in Turkey. His own daughter became an iconic, female leader. She flew a fighter jet in wars in Turkey and dropped bombs and was this sort of iconic feminist. But as Ataturk said, these changes are for the people despite the people, because there was a huge resistance to these changes imposed top down, telling people what they can wear or not wear, how they can practice religion or not practice religion. And you see, there's been, the military has kept Islamism at bay in Turkey, but even still, you've had the rise of an Islamically oriented political party in Turkey. That is what people have voted for overwhelmingly. And now in Tunisia and Morocco, you will see a similar rise of Islamic parties. Now, what does this mean for women's rights? Well, I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. But what you're also seeing in the region that's going on today are some profound demographic shifts. So as I said, this is a part of the world that has underinvested in half of its population. But that is beginning to change. And in the last 20 years in particular, you've had, all across the region, you've had governments embrace female education and actually invest pretty heavily in trying to close their embarrassing gender gaps. And now today, in a country like Egypt, you have full enrollment of boys and girls at the primary school level. Jordan, Saudi, Iran, all across the region, you now have many more girls going to school than ever before. And you also have in the Middle East a phenomenon occurring that's happening around the world. Women are outnumbering men at higher education. Here in the United States, 60% of our college graduates are female today. In Saudi Arabia, 63% of college graduates are women. In Iran, 70% of college graduates are women. We're on the cusp of a very big change that's happening in that part of the world. Harvard Business Review recently did a report looking at human capital in the Emirates. Emirates is a small country, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Sharjah, the different states. But you've got a lot of business going on there. And Harvard Business School did this review looking at the search for talent in that part of the world. And their conclusion is that it's increasingly and overwhelmingly becoming female. So if you want to do business in the Emirates, you better be aware of and looking to hire female graduates, because they make up the vast majority of graduates, and they're much better prepared in many respects, according to this article, than the men. And interestingly, they have this whole survey that they do that measures ambition. And the Emirati women that they surveyed, working women, so it's already a self-selected group, but working women versus American working women had 2.5 times the level of ambition. Interesting. Now, one of the things I hear is, well, in a country like Saudi, so 63% of college graduates are women, what can they do? What jobs can they do? And it's true, today, a lot of employment is off limits to them. Part of the problem for them is that they're not allowed to drive, so transportation is an issue. And there's gender segregation. It's very difficult for companies still to hire women because they have to have separate areas for them to work in. But you're seeing that break down. One of the women I write about in my book, Dr. Haifa Jalal Al-Lail, she's the dean of an innovative women's college in Saudi Arabia. And the first time I went to visit EFAT, the girls were in one room, and there was a male teacher teaching them by video conference in another room. because they can't be in the same room together. We all laugh, ridiculous. I go back a few years later, and now some of the girls are in the room with the professor. And I say, hey, this is interesting, what's going on? And Dr. Haifa tells me, well, the girls came to us and they said, this is ridiculous. And she said, well, get permission from your parents, you can be in the same room, which they did. Now half the girls were in the room, half the girls still not. I come back a few years later, all the girls are in the same room with the male professor. And I say to them, wow, when I was here before, the male professor was in a different room than all the women. And the female students look at me and say, really? When was that? And I said, yeah, about 4 years ago. I mean, not ancient history. But things are changing. In 2009, King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia opened, trying to address that lack of knowledge that the Arab Human Development Report pointed out. Opened a new university with his name on it, of course, King Abdullah University, for science and technology. It has a $10 billion endowment. Makes it one of the largest endowed universities in the world, overnight. And they're hiring science and engineering talent from around the world. And it's co-educational. Women and men enrolled together. Very controversial when it opened. In fact, one of his own clerics came out with a fatwa saying that anyone who supports co-education, men and women going to school together, is going against Islam. Well, the king has his name on the university, so you know who he was criticizing. King Abdullah fired him, hired a new council chair, a new council of ulama to look at this issue of gender segregation, and lo and behold, they come up with a ruling that says, no, it's not against Islam for men and women to be together. In fact, it's absolutely fine. And I bring this up because this whole issue of gender segregation is causing enormous debate and controversy in a country like Saudi today. It's an anachronism that is dying under its own weight. When you have more and more women living a life that is trending towards modernity, to try to impose these restrictions is like holding back the tide. When female education started in Saudi Arabia in 1962, it actually happened because King Faisal at the time, he wanted a big arms package from the United States. He wanted to buy a lot of weapons from the US. As I say, plus ça change, right? That's what they're doing again today. And when he came to Washington, he visited with President Kennedy. Kennedy said to him, I'd love to sell you all these arms, but guess what? My Congress doesn't like you. So can you do two things for me? 1962, can you abolish slavery in your country? The king himself owned hundreds of slaves. And two, can you allow girls to go to school? King Faisal did. That was the start of girls' education, but his clerics resisted him. And they said, if we allow girls to go to school, that's the start of a slippery slope. And they were right. And the fact is today, you have 63% of these college graduates are female, and they are pushing for change. So you may have read in the newspaper recently that the Saudis, trying to, damp down protest in their country, have not only given out over $100 billion in gifts to the people, but they just recently announced that their long-delayed municipal elections would now be held, but women would not be allowed to vote. And immediately, there's a new group that just sprang up that now has thousands of followers called My Country. And it's a group of women who are coming together saying, this cannot be. You must allow us to participate politically. And here are all the reasons, here are all of our rights within Islam that allow us to do so. So one driver of change is certainly rising levels of female education. And I just have been talking about Saudi. I could have been talking about Egypt. I could have been talking about Iran, any of the countries in that part of the world. You see, this is not a revolution, but it's evolution. And it's driving a lot of other changes. Another factor is the role of media. And I'm not talking about Twitter and Facebook, which are all sort of exciting and interesting and very much in the news today. I'm talking about old-fashioned television. About 10 years ago, well, really 20 years ago now, but in a big way, starting 10 years ago, you had an explosion of satellite cable television across the region. Before, television had been state-led and state-controlled and state-dominated. And now everybody watches everything, and there's been a proliferation of shows and formats and new thinking. You know, we always think of Al Jazeera as somehow being this scary, phenomenon. Al Jazeera has had a radical impact in how women's issues are discussed in that part of the world. So I'm sure you're familiar with The View, an American show. Obama went on it recently. 4 women sitting around discussing women's issues. Actually, I've never seen it, but so I've been told. But there's an Arabic version of The View called Sweet Talk, which is modeled explicitly on The View. 4 women sitting around talking about things that are very similar to, would be very familiar to an American viewer. Some recipes, child rearing, health. But they then get into all sorts of very touchy subjects. Domestic abuse, sexual violence, polygamy, why women are not allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia. They bring clerics on the show. They have the Quran. Show us here, where does it say that women aren't allowed to drive a car in the Quran? They have clerics debate why women can't vote. They have debates over why women are forced to wear the hijab. Last year, a woman came on the show, full chador, face covered, just her eyes showing. And she recited a poem that went something like this: "You clerics, you are issuing fatwas that have no basis in religion. You are distorting our religion. You are saying things against women. You have no right to be doing this," on and on and on. The judges loved her, passed her to the next round. Now, there were death threats against the judges for doing so. So I don't mean to sugarcoat this. There is certainly an ideological battle going on. It's not between us and the Islamic world. It's within the Islamic world. And women have an enormous stake in the outcome. More so than men, because so many of the rules and regulations are directed at women. It's control. And as I said earlier, the lived reality of women's lives is increasingly diverging from those, in many respects, medieval restrictions on women. Last year, again, I'm picking on Saudi for good reason. It's easy to pick on Saudi. A Saudi cleric, this issue of gender segregation is coming up again and again. When can men and women mix and be together in the same place? I mean, if you can't be in a public place with a man, how can you ever live a normal life? Well, the answer is you can't. Last year, a Saudi cleric thought long and hard about this issue and came up with this solution. He said, women, if you breastfeed your male colleagues at work 5 times, you will develop that, familial bond, and then it's okay to be alone in the same room with them. Okay, I mean, ludicrous. I didn't make this up. I can't make this stuff up. And the reaction, of course, across the Muslim world was ridicule. Ridicule. Who are these guys so out of touch that they could actually seriously put something like that forward? Now, he immediately backtracked. I was wrong. My reading of, this was completely wrong, and had to retract it. But the point I'm making is that women are chafing increasingly at all of these restrictions. So What's going on today? Well, I could spend hours talking about that. But as I said in the beginning, you've had two of the most, from a legal perspective, secular countries, Tunisia and Egypt, now go through revolutions with new governments taking shape. And I think there's reason to be cautious for women because, as we've seen in other instances in Iraq, for example, when you've had the overthrow of a bad guy in Iraq, but he did have a relatively secular approach, it unleashed, democracy there has unleashed a conservative religious majority. And we may see the same thing in Tunisia and Egypt. In Egypt, polls show that 90% of the people say that they want Sharia to be either a source or the source of law. And so, given that, how women navigate politically and legally this new landscape will be critically important. Because to simply assert that they must have their rights because of universal human rights declarations or universalist principles is probably not going to be sufficient in this new landscape. They will have to appeal on religious grounds, whether they like it or not. And you've seen women do this, most notably in Morocco. In 2004, they reformed their family law, the Mudawana, which was really stacked in many ways against women. And they reformed it with the blessing of the clerics. In Islam it says one of the dimensions of reform was polygamy. The Quran says, marry as you will up to 4 wives, which is the basis for polygamy. But there's a second part to that. It says, marry as you will up to 4 wives, but only do so if you can treat them all equally, and you can't treat them all equally, so only marry one. Correct? And the women are reading it now for themselves and saying, why don't you ever read the but part? And by the way, let's focus on that second half, and the clerics have said, you're right. And now in Morocco, to be able to take a second wife is virtually impossible. You have to get permission from the first wife in writing. You have to get permission from a judge who can guarantee you're going to treat them all equally, blah, 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 blah. It makes it practically impossible. And these changes that have been implemented to the benefit of women have, as I said, been done with the blessing of the clerics. A similar process has happened in other countries. And I think what you're going to see increasingly is women pushing for these legal changes and getting a lot of support from men behind them too. As one Tunisian man said, my God, why would we want to take a second wife? But change is happening across the region. And when my book came out, some of the critics said, interesting, but marginal. That part of the world, nothing good ever comes out of it. Nothing's going to change. These women who are pushing for more democratic, progressive elements in society, few and far between, lone voices in the wilderness. And I say, look at what's happening today. There is tremendous demand for a better world and a better society in these places. And when you look at what's happening, women are very much a part of the change, and women's rights will be a litmus test for what direction those countries go in, whether they will be able to achieve a more democratic system or not. You watch what happens on women's rights, and that will be the ultimate test. I'm going to wrap up there and take questions from you in the audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isobel. Hi, I'm curious if you can explain the phenomenon that there now seem to be female suicide bombers from time to time, and what has caused that, and do you see this as something that's going to continue to grow?
The question, did everybody hear that question? Is why is there the phenomenon of female suicide bombers? Well, I think the simple explanation is that as it's become harder to get men through a lot of the security and checkpoints, these groups have turned to women. And women are motivated to become suicide bombers, in many cases for different reasons than men, but there's still a supply there of women who are willing to blow themselves up. If you look, there have been a couple of studies done of female suicide bombers. Many of them have, lost a brother, a father, an uncle, and they see this as, appropriate revenge. A lot of them are mentally unstable and have been kind of inculcated into a cult, which I think is not dissimilar from some of the men. But you do see, there was a whole study done of some of these women who failed to detonate themselves and ended up in Israeli prisons. And there's some interesting work that's been done on them. But, men and women both can go terribly wrong.
Hi. I was wondering, when you were talking about how Islamic parties in Turkey have been growing, how far have they grown so far? Like, have they been succeeding trying to take over the government? Have they been...
Well, they have taken over the government. The Prime Minister and the President are both from the AKP, which they don't describe themselves as an Islamist party, but they are an Islamist party. Their roots are certainly within Islamism, but they've also, that's a reality. But they're very moderate in many respects and have been doing a lot of important economic reforms and political reforms, too, in an attempt to continue to try to make Turkey eligible for membership in the EU. So, the fact is that Turkish politics has been dominated for nearly a decade by the AKP, and it looks like in the next election they're slated to win heavily again. President Erdogan is very, very popular today and continues to be so.
Thank you.
I heard you say that the Quran is being challenged more and more as women are becoming more and more educated. And I guess they're trying to find some loopholes. Just how far do you think that will go and take these women as to where they would like to go?
I don't know. I wouldn't say that they're challenging the Quran. They're challenging interpretations of the Quran. They're challenging selective reading of the Quran. How far can it go? What I say at the end of my book is that ultimately, you need a secular system. You need a separation of religion and politics to achieve women's rights, human rights, in a full way. Because if you're constantly having to fight religious arguments, it's, that's a ground that, shifts. But today, these are not secular societies, and they're not even trending in a secular direction. So I view this engagement with religion and with more progressive interpretations of religion as a stepping stone in many ways for these societies to find an accommodation between what's really culture and religion and modernity. And that's the ultimate struggle.
Question here.
Hi. I'm of Middle Eastern descent and also happen to be of the minority of Christians who are of Middle Eastern. I was saying that I am of Middle Eastern descent and of the Christian minority that are of Middle Eastern descent. And I was just wondering, I'm often fascinated by that and having visited the region. Can you speak to the role of Christian women in these Islamic countries and how that kind of plays into everything?
Well, I must admit, I didn't focus at all on Christian women because it just wasn't what I was writing about. Although I certainly have many Christian friends from the region, Iraqi Christian, Syrian Christian, Egyptian Christian friends, there are Christians throughout the region. The reality is everything that I'm talking about, this accommodation with Sharia and women's rights, applies equally to non-Muslims. So in the same way that a more progressive reading of the Quran can accommodate greater rights for women, you must have the same or a similar progressive reading of the Quran to accommodate a role for non-Muslims. And there are societies that are struggling with this, where they have sizable Christian populations, or just non-Muslim populations.
Yeah, the statistic about 63% of the graduates.
Can you speak into the microphone?
Oh, right here? Okay, that 63% of the graduates are women. But in many of the economically advantaged Arabian culture, the children are sent to America and England. What percentage of girls leave home and go study abroad?
Yeah.
Is that statistic only for Saudi Arabia?
That
Or does it
statistic
include
is
those who have emigrated?
no. That's within Saudi Arabia. That's for the
those
vast.
are the guys left behind.
Yeah, but it's the vast majority. You do have elites who've gone overseas, but women also go overseas. So that may account for a small percent or two of that difference, but
So the
but
ones
not
who-
the 13%.
Okay, because I
Yeah.
thought statistically maybe.
No, I mean it may account for maybe if you took into account the number of men who go overseas, maybe it goes down to, as a total, 58% are female instead of 63, but not, actually, the Saudi government offers scholarships for their young people to go abroad, and those scholarships are given to women. Absolutely. Actually, one of the women I write about in my book. Yeah, they do. They do. They absolutely do. One of the women I write in my book is a journalist, a Saudi journalist, who, again, it's this phenomenon of media and the changing role of media. She is a female journalist who became the first female bureau chief of a daily paper in Saudi. And she's on one of these scholarships now, studying at the University of Newcastle in England. And when I saw her not long ago, she said, I want to be the country's first foreign minister, first female foreign minister. I said, good luck to you. But she's as determined as any woman I've ever met.
You gave us a wonderfully informative presentation, and I thank you.
Thank you.
I'm encouraged to read your book very soon and not even wait for the film version. So, yes, my question is about enlisting allies from the other side, if you will, so from the male side, knowing that many social movements have made great use of allies. Is there a substantial or significant number of male feminists?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you. And I write a lot about that in my book because, throughout the ages, women have fought for their rights in countries around the world and throughout history, but have been helped, crucially by men. I mean, ultimately, in 1920, when women got the right to vote in this country, it was a male Congress that voted for it. And many of the examples I was giving in my talk are about men, whether it's King Abdullah. I mean, gosh, would he describe himself as a feminist? But he has been quietly encouraging changes for women against a lot of internal criticism and disapproval. King Mohammed in Morocco, he was very much a strong supporter of women and the reform of the Mudawana in Morocco. In Iran, I have a section in the whole chapter in the book on Iran, but there's one of the leading clerics. There are about a dozen grand ayatollahs in the world. And one of them is Grand Ayatollah Sistani, who happens to live in Najaf in Iraq. But in Iran, the Grand Ayatollahs mostly live in Qom, the religious city. And one of them, Grand Ayatollah Saneh, is known as the women's mufti because he really engages so much on these progressive interpretations of Islam and gives fatwas on behalf of the women. You know, several years ago, the Ahmadinejad government tried to push forward something perversely called the Family Protection Act in Iran that was going to set women's rights even further back. And the women mobilized, they protested, and they got lots and lots of men to support them, including Grand Ayatollah Saneh, who came out and said, these changes are not just bad and morally wrong, but they're against Islam. So you have, you know, a lot of men who are very much a part of this movement, and a lot of the intellectual leaders of Islamic feminism are in fact men. And many of them have found little comfort in their own countries on these topics and are living now in Europe and in the United States, but their ideas are flowing back into the region.
Will you please tell our audience about the significance of Paradise Beneath Her Feet, the title of your book?
Thank you. Where does the title come from? Well, you know, the title, Muslims always say to me, oh, it's such a beautiful title, it's from the Quran. It's actually not from the Quran, it's from one of the hadiths, a saying of Muhammad. But when I was in Saudi some years ago, a well-intentioned gentleman there, American educated by the way, very patronizingly explains to me why it is that women can't drive and can't own property and can't have a business registered in their name and can't leave their home without the legal permission of a man, of their father or husband, of their male legal guardian. You see, in Islam, we revere our women. We love them and want to protect them, unlike you in the West. And you see, we have a saying in Islam that paradise lies beneath the feet of mothers. And so on this ground, he says to me, this is why. And on another visit to Saudi, a group of Saudi women come up to me and they say, you know, the reason we should be able to own our own businesses and drive and vote and do blah, blah, blah is because, you see, in Islam, we are revered. And there's a saying that paradise lies beneath the feet of mothers. And I thought, okay, well, this encapsulates for me, you know, men are from Mars and women from Venus. You know, they are reading the Quran differently. So that's where it comes from. Thank you.
You have a question there? Yes. Women in the Arab world, I think, have made huge strides in strengthening civil society in many of these countries by working in education and community organizations, healthcare, things like that. And I just wondered if you saw now with the change of regimes in Egypt and Tunisia that there will be a role for people who have normally been more active in the sort of civil society building to take an active role in in the legislature and in the lawmaking. I mean, it seems like you just alluded to how hard it would be for that woman to become a foreign minister. I mean,
well,
are
in
there
Saudi, in Saudi,
but even in I think even in Tunisia and Jordan and Egypt, do you see more women getting involved in the in the actual
several
creating of the new governments?
But even in previous, I mean, under Mubarak, you had female ministers, lots of them. I mean, not a majority, but over the years, I've met female ministers in Minister of Labor, Deputy Minister, Foreign Minister, Deputy Finance Minister. So you've had women in lots of different positions. I think what you're going to see is, it's a whole new political landscape. And I think you'll find that women will be encouraged in many ways to engage politically. And, I think that everything's being turned upside down right now. And when the mold is broken, it creates opportunities too. And I think you'll find a lot of women taking advantage of those opportunities who are inspired by the youth and by the promise of what seemed impossible even a few months ago.
Question in the way. I guess to your earlier point, you were referring to the title of your quote. I think between men and women, especially in Islam, there's often different interpretation when it comes to these gender issues. I was wondering how, traditionally, Aisha, the Prophet's wife, has been an influential character in Islam, and how influential is she to the role of Muslim women and with their interpretation and kind of using that to kind of bolster or push themselves forward in this day and age?
Well, I think it's, there are a number of, female role models in early Islam. I mean, Aisha's one, but Khadija is certainly one. I mean, my Saudi chapter is called Channeling Khadija, because, as you may know, Khadija was Muhammad's first wife of many, but she was older than him. She was a very successful businesswoman, and she hired the young Muhammad to drive her caravans. And he did a good job, and she came back and gave him a tip and proposed marriage, which he readily accepted. And, when he started having his visions all about, God speaking through him, Khadija listened and didn't say, "You're crazy." In fact, she became the first convert to Islam. And, she bankrolled the early faith. I mean, it was her money that allowed Muhammad to go on his speaking tour. And the Saudi women, they're pushing for change through the economic angle. They're not leading with, "We want our right to drive," because they know how incendiary that is. Instead, they're leading with, "We want to own our own business. We want to control our own income," like Khadija. In fact, they have at the Chamber of Commerce, they have the Khadija Center, where all these businesswomen come together. And guess what they're debating? Guess what change they're pushing? They're pushing for a rereading of the texts around this whole gender segregation issue, because they know that they can't get off square one when they run the risk of being arrested for being in a public space with a man, as has happened, by the way, frequently.
We have time for just a couple more questions. I think there's a question over there and then one here.
And just to the point of men, it's very influential businessmen in Saudi who are encouraging and pushing the women to be out in front on these issues, because they know, as Bill Gates told them very directly at a business conference that I happened to attend some years ago in Jeddah, he looked at the audience and he said, "Guys, you're going to be net losers in the world economy if you can't figure out this whole women thing." And they know that.
Within the family structure itself, are the women finding resistance amongst their children, especially their sons? And if they are, is there a dividing line, such as the 5-year-old son thinks this is wonderful, but the 16-year-old son thinks this is crazy? Do you know anything about that?
I think that it's different by families. There are a lot of progressive fathers who've raised strong daughters and open-minded sons, and there are families that haven't. And so some women are supported by their fathers and brothers, and others are fighting against them. So it's really, it's across the board.
You see, as women are gaining some political role, some voice in economics, do you see them gaining any voice in religious leadership?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, interestingly, women are becoming part of the production of religion and religious interpretation. At Al-Azhar, one of the great seat of Sunni scholarship, has a women's college and is turning out women religious leaders. In Morocco, they have a whole program, I write about it in my book, of training women to be preachers, murshidat. They can do everything the men do except lead the Friday prayer. Now, what's behind that? Well, very explicitly, the government, King Mohammed, thought that this would be a way to help temper extremism in society, to get women working in the production of religion and working as religious voices and leaders in their communities. Turkey has done something similar. Qatar is doing something similar. So across the board, it's new. You know, there's not a critical mass yet, but they're training women to be religious leaders. And I think that will also give some momentum to the changes that are going on. Any other? We're done. Okay.